Okay. Okay, I am happy with how many have joined so far, and I'm sure more will trickle in over the next few minutes. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started and welcome everyone here today. This is the Berkeley Film Foundation's second virtual workshop of the year. I really hope each one of you is healthy and well, and I'm so glad and appreciative that you've joined us during a very stressful time in our world. Thank you for taking a bit of time to join us today. So the last time we did this was in April, and unfortunately, our situation and circumstances haven't changed all that much since then. So BFF is probably going to be doing these virtual workshops for the foreseeable future. Normally, they're in person at the David Brower Center, but we hope to get back in there at some point. They're a wonderful partner here in downtown Berkeley, but only when it's safe to do so. So for now, we're going to be doing them virtually, and we do them about twice a year. So the next one will likely be next March or April. So just a few housekeeping items. I'm sure all of us are very, very familiar with Zoom by this point, but just to repeat, this is a webinar, so I can't see any of the attendees, but please don't let that discourage you from interacting with us. If you have a question, you can write it, type it in the Q&A window, which is at the bar along the bottom of the screen. And you can also use the chat window, but Q&A is best for questions. And I will be curating these questions in real time, so I'll do my best to get yours asked. So today, the topic of our conversation is meeting the moment, how independent filmmakers can work toward better representation, diversity, and equity in the planning and the execution of your film. What this means is we continue to ask the question of what practices can I start implementing today that could make my film more inclusive? And I chose this topic because when the conversation around systemic racism in the film industry is discussed, it usually refers to the Hollywood system, which, as we know, is really only a small part of the film, not a small part, it is one part of the film industry. But I wanted to shift the focus and really zero in on what independent filmmakers can do today to contribute to the larger sea change in the industry. And I see this as a conversation for filmmakers to really understand what inclusion looks like and how to implement it themselves. So each of our panelists are filmmakers themselves, and they'll use their own work and experiences as examples to help highlight what we're talking about today. So let me introduce everyone. I'm so glad all three of you could join us. And first is Selina Lewis Davidson. Selina co-founded Greenhouse Pictures in 2003, a documentary production company that has produced more than 15 nationally broadcast documentaries, including the Emmy-nominated Hard Road Home and Occupation Dreamland. She is currently co-directing and producing Acts of Reparation with her longtime filmmaking partner, Macky Alston, who I will introduce next. This is a documentary feature and an impact campaign that follows the grassroots movement for reparations initiatives, which are aimed at helping to heal the historic generational injury caused by slavery and the Native American genocide across the United States. And Selina is an East Bay resident, so she is not too far away from me right now. Next is Macky Alston. Macky is the founder of Auburn Media, which is a program of Auburn Seminary in New York that has equipped more than 10,000 faith leaders to speak out for justice using media. Along with Selina, Macky is co-directing and producing Acts of Reparation. Over his career, Macky has directed and produced 5 feature documentaries to date, 2 of which won awards at Sundance and 3 were nominated for Emmys. His films have ranged in the topics of legacy of slavery to mass incarceration to LGBTQ equality. And Macky joins us today from New York over Zoom. So lastly, I'm very happy to introduce André Perez. André is a Latinx educator, filmmaker, and community organizer whose practice centers on collaboration and multimedia storytelling. He founded the Transgender Oral History Project in 2007 and co-founded a transitional home for LGBTQ youth in 2012 and helped grow the only transgender suicide hotline in 2015. Amazing. André went on to direct America in Transition, a Sundance-backed documentary series exploring community, family, and social issues with trans and BIPOC youth that debuted at Outfest Fusion in 2018. And I believe he'll be showing a clip of that later on. André is currently producing a film called A Run for More, which is a feature-length film following Frankie Gonzalez-Wolf in her fight to become the first openly transgender elected official in Texas. And I've seen a clip of that, and that is an incredible film to wait for. So welcome everyone. Thank you for being with us today. And so I guess I want to start with a question for the group. Next, we'll be breaking off to show film clips, but the first, I just want to pose a broad question to everyone today. So in light of the intensified level of the Black Lives Matter movement this year, the industry is calling for equitable, ethical filmmaking and an expansion of representation in the industry. And you know, that's a big question for people to tackle right now. But I'd like to know what that looks like for you. What would you like to see, at least the immediate changes to be made, and but how do you feel when you hear those calls to action? And I guess go ahead, Selina, please.
Yeah. Hello, thank you for having us. Yeah, it's a heavy, important question. And for me, me and Macky have worked together for 25 years, and I had always felt that I have always been ethical, right? But that's evolved in terms of what questions are we asking of ourselves as filmmakers, and in terms of what time it is. Things that I started with a motto when I was like 22 years old, that I wanted to tell stories or help tell stories that wouldn't necessarily be told otherwise, and also to help give voice to people who are rarely heard. And that is a motto that I have continued to have. And so what has changed in terms of the questions that particularly me and Macky over the last couple of years have been asking ourselves. I'm a producer generally, but now I'm a co-director on this film. I had always, pay equity was always important. Diversity in crew and staff was always important to me. But now really wanting to question, what is our relationship with our participants that we, are including in our films? To me is really key in terms of what's one of the things that is needed to be questioned by filmmakers today.
So changing the sort of format of how you interact with your subjects, and just rethinking that relationship. Yeah.
And it's whose story is it? And like there's so many things that fall into that category. Are you being an extractive storyteller? like really filmmakers, what they can do is question themselves. There's lots of stuff going on, which is really exciting within our community, to even, really hold, distributors accountable, funders accountable, really trying to tackle all angles of independent filmmaking. But there's a lot that we are responsible as storytellers and filmmakers to ask of ourselves in terms of being equitable and just ethical filmmaking. And once you start the conversation, it raises up a lot of things, and some of it we'll share later, because me and Macky have had conversations for a long time.
Got it. Thank you.
Mac?
What I would add is that I feel like when I entered into the documentary film business, it was early 90s, and I was coming out of an activist orientation through ACT UP and in New York City. And in fact, Selina, the way we met through Maria Magenti was because we were in ACT UP pals who wanted to use media for activism. And so I think about the shoulders on which we stand, both with media activists and other activists, in regard to racial justice, representation, equity, and at the same time, I do believe that there's a kind of explosion that's taking place similar to this generation's explosion of activism and uprising, and that is really exciting. And in some ways, it's hard to keep up with. And so I'll just name a couple of moments that have helped me revise, review, and think differently about our practices that Selina and I, and it's interesting also to be at this for 25 years. And so to be in the process of interrogating our own practice. It's not like we're going up against the man. We're going up against, white supremacy and patriarchy and all the forms of systemic oppression that we were raised to practice, and that we have been practicing in different ways, while at the same time we've had these ethical commitments. So I remember being at a Doc Society gathering, a Good Pitch gathering, where I was one of the mentors working in 2019 with the new group of projects that were being showcased in the 2019 USA Good Pitch. And one thing that I think is so critical is the way that we're teaching one another in community, and particularly folks who have experienced the kind of oppression that we are wanting to stand against are teaching the rest of the industry. So I remember two people, particularly in that Good Pitch, Loira Limble from Firelight, who was making a film called Through the Night, and Sam Fetter, who was making a film called Disclosure. And Sam was the person who stood up in that Good Pitch and said, our team has committed to compensating every participant in the project, because all the folks who are giving their wisdom and time have typically and commonly not been seen and valued for their expertise, the trans folk who are in that film. And Sam's sharing, I feel like it cut through the whole room, and suddenly the bar was raised for the industry in that moment, or at least for the sample that was in the room. And so then Selina and I began to talk about it on our project. Similarly, there was a symposium, a collective wisdom symposium at MIT on co-creation that Kat Isaac and a lot of people were involved in, which was one of those, gotta say, gatherings of our industry that just, it blew up around this issue because we were, the right practice is so emergent that the design of the conference was behind the curve. And so right in the experience of it, we were trying to reform and evolve. And that was painful, gotta say, if anybody was there or remembers it.
When was that about? Do you
That was in September 2018. And, but there was a real ethic at the center of that work. A, to not invisibilize the many folk who are involved in the creation of a film or media project. And so the sort of myth of the auteur and a film by one human being that just erases who's providing the stories, all the hands and hearts and minds and spirits that are actually involved in the creating of the work. That was at the core of the genesis of that conference. And there was a mantra at the center of the conference too, which is, if you are wondering whether or not you ought to be telling this story, there's probably a good chance that this is not your story to tell. And it was then that I really stepped back and thought, all right, what movies have I made that maybe I wasn't the right person to make? And what movie do I feel like I'm particularly well positioned and authorized to participate in the making of, but who also must participate in the making of that and have authorship. And so this reparations project emerged in and around that time.
It's a difficult question to ask yourself, for sure. Wow. André, what is your gut reaction to the industry calling for equitable, ethical filmmaking in this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think my response is the same as maybe my response across the board is, it's about time. This is something that we've needed to address for a long time. We will probably continue to need to address for a long time. And it's exciting to see people coming to the table who haven't been at the table. But also it's to say that, I think sometimes we have this inclination to kind of think of things as being very novel, right? Especially in media, people are trying to be like on the cutting edge or something. And I think it's also important to recognize that there have been people who are thinking and talking about these issues for a long time before it became this like big public conversation. But for me, I think that I think I've always been drawn to documentary, but I've always been kind of conflicted, because I think documentary kind of comes out of this colonialist framework. Really, like our whole tradition is rooted in ethnography and kind of this idea of like the white British people who went out and discovered the world and then came back and wanted to like share, about the world and what it is. And that's not to say, I think that there's this thing like when you become politicized, like that you can be like, oh, everything I loved is awful. But at the same time, you can say, well, there are things that are good and about it, and also there are things that we don't need to keep redoing. And that doesn't mean that you have to say that like everything that we've ever done is terrible, right? But it's like, how do we unlearn the more, like I really resonate with what Macky was saying, right? That there's so much to unlearn as individuals and also as an industry, and just recognizing, because we also come out of this sort of news tradition that claims to be objective. And what is objectivity other than just reinforcing the status quo, right? And when you challenge that status quo, you come from this different perspective and you're really vocal about that, you get shut out of newsrooms. A good friend of mine was the first transgender reporter to ever work, at NPR, at Marketplace, and got very publicly fired right after the 2016 election because he wrote a blog post just sort of questioning objectivity and saying that, he's like, as a transgender reporter, there's a lot, I'm being asked to report on trans news in this quote objective way that reinforces, the for and against in these bathrooms cases. And really against was saying, oh, I'm not human, I don't deserve to go to the bathroom, I shouldn't exist in public life. And he's like, well, how can I like, how is that authentic? And what does it mean that you're putting me in this abusive position to have to kind of regurgitate these things that I think don't have really much validity? But the reality is that, you know, that a lot of media, like, it's not just NPR, right? But a lot of media and a lot of documentary gets funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and we're constantly being brought into this kind of questions around, you know, are we representing both sides? And so I really think that there's so much work to be done just around just reconceptualizing some of the fundamental assumptions about what we should value as an industry. And I think that that's in the process of changing, and that's part of what makes me feel hopeful. You know, for film, a lot more so than for something like radio, right? That I think that there is a lot more recognition around authenticity and around people's unique perspectives being important, you know, and I think that, but the most important thing to me is saying, like, it's about opening up possibility. And it's like, if we're coming from this deficit-based framework that is like, oh, well, we feel guilty and we're getting called out, and so we're going to try to like patch up the problem by going out and giving a couple of like Black filmmakers some money and maybe putting them in our festival. Like, you know, if it's kind of coming from this place that's about kind of, you know, sort of covering your, you know, covering yourself and not being sort of liable, then I think that that's really the wrong method. I think it's really, to me, about saying, what are all the amazing, talented people who have never had an opportunity to share their stories? What is all the creativity that is like waiting to be unearthed? And when people feel more empowered and emboldened, then we can really have this like, this incredible ecology, like creative ecology that doesn't exist. And so thinking about it from that perspective.
I like that. And not adhering to quotas for the sake of quotas, you know, not hiring so many people of color filmmakers for the sake of meeting these numbers. It's actually about widening accessibility and to see creativity as an opportunity, seeing this as a way to finally get different perspectives and shifting focus. I love that. So we're actually going to pass the reins to André, who is going to show us a clip of his film America in Transition, and it's about 5 minutes, and I think he's going to also talk about it afterwards. So he's going to share the screen, and you can take it away, André.
Awesome. Yeah. So this is a little bit of a 5-minute mashup from my series about trans folks of color across the country. Let me.
A crush. The very first time I had a crush, I was so young, the very first time I had a crush. And I knew that I shouldn't have this crush, right? Because I had a crush on someone of the same sex. I had to be like maybe 5 or 6. And I don't know why I saw the neighbor as so attractive. I think he was just a bad boy, you know, he was bad. And I was attracted to that because I was so good. And I think I wanted to live his life.
My name is André Gauthier. I am a transgender model, activist, law student, and business owner. Modeling for me is way more than me smiling on a magazine. I'm smiling for kids that are afraid.
What do you take shots for?
For me to grow my beard.
But you're already growing your beard.
I know.
I don't understand that. Why?
I have to have it continue to grow. If I don't keep doing it, then these will just like, they'll trickle away. I remember calling her. She seemed kind of weak on the phone or, you know, like sad. I could just hear it in her voice. And I'm like, you know, like, hey mom, what's up? And she was like, they've diagnosed me with cancer.
And you always like to hug and kiss me on my face.
I did. One of the most difficult things throughout our lives together was transitioning and kind of coming out for us to...
It took a lot of time.
It took a lot of time.
It was painful to me and it was devastating.
Never could have made it without you. I would have lost it all. But now I see how you were there for me. Oh.
A lot of parents, when their kids are any type of LGBTQ, they are like, oh, where did I go wrong? It's like, wait a minute, you did it.
My wife and I met in the Marine Corps, and she tried to help me mend my relationship that was breaking because of my transition. She was like, oh, I'm gonna go do this training in Fort Sam Houston, which is a couple of hours away. I should, you know, come hang out with you on the weekends to get away from all these Marines and be a lesbian, right? And I'm like, yeah, we'll totally go out like to the gay bars and we'll like, you know, be each other's wingman. That's not what she was planning. She's always been supportive. When I was trying to repair my relationship, she was like, you know, somebody's gonna love you for who you are as a trans man. I didn't realize she was talking about her. But, you know, so I say that she scout sniped me. I had a target on my heart, and she from Tennessee just shot a bullet, and I was done.
My background was always rooted in religion, but more spirituality, because my grandmother said God is not a thing, God is a feeling, God is an emotion, God is love. And so that always was very resonant with me. It spoke to me because being a trans woman and walking up into a church most times, people didn't want you to be there. There was always the stigma over your head because you're really not worthy to praise God in the way that genetic cis women praise God. But honey, have I got news for them.
Am I back?
You are.
Okay. But yeah, I guess just like a little bit about.
That was beautiful.
Oh, thank you. But yeah, like to me, you know, I guess I come from a background, you know, of activism, of being really engaged in the community. And for me, that was the reason for wanting to share stories, was feeling, you know, similar to what Selina was saying, you know, feeling frustrated with what was out there, feeling like there are so many trans stories that have never been told. And so, you know, and I started this process, you know, because films take a long time, you know, about 6 years ago. And it's like, at that time, I started going around and pitching it. And I was like, oh, you know, I'm trans, I'm Puerto Rican, I'm from the South. And I feel like there are so many stories that you've never heard of. And people are like, wait, and I'm like, we need to talk about trans people in the South. We need to talk about trans people in rural America. We need to talk about trans people of faith. We need to talk about indigenous folks who are two-spirit. We need, you know, and people were just like their minds were like blown. They're like, wait, you're trans? Like transgender? You know? So it was just like, before even being able to like have the conversation about the things I was excited about, I'd have all these like fundamental conversations, and it was a hard sell. It was a hard sell because people were like, they didn't really believe there were trans people in the South. And then unfortunately, you know, what happened was during the course of filming, it all came to a head, right? Like that's when all the bathrooms bills started coming out. That's when, you know, trans folks in immigration detention facilities were being put in solitary confinement. And so I think that there's this, you know, important thing, which is like actually when people are really deeply invested and embedded in communities, of course they understand some of the things like without even thinking about it or trying to project into the future, right? Like people understand what's important to them and what's important to people in their lives. And so, yeah, I'm just like, how do we create more opportunities to support folks and to think of it as a collective process? Because like I gathered a community advisory board together at all these people who are part of these emerging trans POC organizations. And I was like, what's a story that you never want to hear again? And what's the story that you wish you could see? And people had so many incredible generative ideas. And that was really, for me, that was like the impetus of it, was saying, well, let me go talk to some people who are part of trans poly families. And, you know, let me go talk to some people who are living with HIV in the South. And, you know, and so I just think that I think that we need to support, we need to tear down this idea that like the director is like the person, right? And to say like, how do we create more collaborative possibilities? How do we create more community input? And that it's actually, I believe that it is a right of a community to have a say in how people see and understand your community. And for me, that's really important because I'm like, as a trans person, you know, there was a survey that went out on Facebook. More people said they had seen a ghost than had ever met a trans person. So, you know, it's like, so it's like the idea that what people see on TV, that's probably their only like actual interaction they're gonna have with a trans person. And that forms so much of the basis of what they think trans people are and whether or not they think we should have rights. And so that was where I was coming from. And I think that's true for many communities. Maybe it's not quite as extreme, but that it's like actually, we have to be accountable to communities for how our films are going to influence their quality of life and are going to influence how people see and understand them. And I think that that needs to be like a fundamental aspect of what it means to make an ethical film.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what was the response that you got from distributors, from people when you told them about this film? Were they, and you said you had to sort of start at the beginning by explaining, you know, the basics. What was the initial response, and was it an easy film to produce, given all of
not
the
easy
heavy
to produce?
Right.
You know, and I mean, there's a variety of reasons for that. You know, I'm not nearly as experienced, you know, as Selina and Macky. I feel very grateful to be on this panel with you guys. But, you know, I think that like, as an emerging filmmaker, you know, it's always more difficult. And so part of it is like, how do we create more opportunities for emerging filmmakers? Because if we want the film industry to look different than it has always looked, then that means we have to invite a lot more people in who have never been there before. But it's also like, how do we support those people in having a pathway to professionalism, a pathway to figuring out how to get paid for their work? How do we support people in figuring out how to negotiate and interact with all these different distributors and producers? And because, you know, that's all very complicated, and it feels like, yeah, it feels like it can be very overwhelming for most of the time, on top of all of the stuff about actually making the film you want to make. But yeah, I mean, the responses, honestly, I'd say the most disheartening aspect of the responses I got was a lot of people didn't necessarily approach me as a professional. You know, like I was talking to them, you know, I felt like sharing part of my story was part of why I want to be a filmmaker, and was why I, you know, like I thought it was important to the kind of film I wanted to make, in terms of where my sort of authority, I guess, was coming from. But at the same time, it felt like that often derailed the conversation. People then wanted to talk about their trans cousin, or like ask me kind of invasive personal questions. So it felt like kind of a double-edged sword of not being sure like how to negotiate that as a trans person who's also a professional, and like how do I get taken as a professional, but also but I want to position myself as someone who's trying to share stories from my community, because that's so core to what I want to do and what I think is important about what I want to do. I don't know if that's,
and you want to connect, and you want to make a connection with people, but they seem to interpret that differently. Sounds like, yeah.
And I think without intending to, that people can come off in this kind of tokenizing way. I guess that's the other thing, is people were like, oh, well, we have our trans story, thanks, but we're good. We already booked our trans, speaker or whatever. And it's, so I think that, and I think that's true, like I said, of many communities. It's not just the trans community. So I'm always questioning, like, how do we showcase diversity within communities? How do we showcase, an authentically, and when I say diversity, I guess I mean, the fact that our communities are inherently mutually contradictory, and we come from many positionalities, and we have many different perspectives. And so it's like, how do we really bring that to the forefront in thinking about what it means to support filmmakers and communities? I think that when I think about the difference between representation and equity, the idea that like representation is who's on the screen. But in documentary, we've been showcasing mostly people of color stories for most of social issue documentary, but they've been made mostly by white folks who are not from those communities. So when I think about equity, it's really much more thinking about what are the structures and systems, and how do we create structures and systems that support people from communities in sharing their own stories? And how do we not just sort of hand select the people who kind of reinforce our assumptions about what those communities are in that process? And how do we, and maybe part of it is a numbers game. You kind of said this idea of like not a quota for quota's sake, but I guess I would also say, I'm not against a quota. Like, I think if we had $10,000, instead of spending it on one filmmaker who we feel like we have to vet extensively to make sure they are the film, like the filmmaker who we can trust to complete a project, what if we micro-granted, 50 filmmakers, $2,000 to do a 2-minute thing, and then we decided who to give the rest of that $500,000 or something? Like, how do we create systems and structures that help a lot of people have low stakes, like lowers the bars for entry for a bigger number of people to come into it, as opposed to saying, well, we have Spike Lee films, and so we don't need to fund future Black filmmakers.
Right. Yeah, that's not, that's definitely counterproductive for sure. And I think you're right. I think changing the structure that the film industry works within that's part of looking internally and changing the way that these funding structures are impacting these filmmakers' lives, and giving $2,000 to a filmmaker of color who would otherwise not have any other opportunities. That could be a really powerful thing. So, well, thank you so much for that. So we're going to pivot next to Selina and Macky, who will be showing a clip of their film Reparations, and also doing a brief presentation about their code of ethics that they'd like to share with us today. And so again, while you're watching, feel free to drop some questions. I've seen a question so far, and we are actually going to get to this question very soon, so I'm not going to answer that now. But anyway, so I think we can move on to Macky and Selina.
Macky,
So I am sharing screen. And here is a segment of a work sample that we made in the last year. When I asked you to engage in this project 25 years after we made Family Name, why didn't you just say, Macky, we did it, we're done, let's do something else?
Well, I feel like there was unfinished business even from Family Name, right? And that was 25 years ago we spoke about that. And you also spoke about me.
And you've always had a movie in you that you've said you wanted to do.
Right.
About your family.
This might be the opportunity for that. I've always been really connected in terms of kind of my matrilineal lines. Growing up, heard of past grandmas who were kick-ass, basically. They're all from different racial, ethnic groups. And
different lives. And so I wanted to be able to chart a teeny bit of history. And then the Native American grandma, because I don't have the history that is accessible to me is not everything. To me, what was compelling is to learn more about your family and have you learn about my family, and for us to learn from each other, looking at our families in the current lens.
I'm interested in the moral imagination of the people back then. I'm also interested in the moral imagination of us.
Mm-hmm.
So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Bless you.
I'm Macky Alston.
I'm Mamie Hillman.
Mamie Hillman is building a new museum devoted to African American history and truth-telling just down the road from where our family home place is located.
I've been working on this since 1995. I'm pregnant with it. This baby's in the birth position, and it's going to be born. I think sometimes it's hard for some people to stand on their square, as my son say. But you got to stand on your square for the totality of who you are.
In Atlanta, on the 50th anniversary of the Black Manifesto, we meet organizers doing reparations work with a white church.
On behalf of myself and on behalf of my country, to you and to all African Americans from the beginning of our nation's history, please hear this from our hearts. I apologize. Please forgive us.
You know, it's one thing to conceive something, and then it's another thing to see it, play itself out. A prayer of apology. That's one level. Then you have to look at what people's actions are.
The work of reparations.
And I think we're at this point. We're at a point. Alarm is sounding. Are you gonna answer it? Are we gonna answer it?
So basically, the Black Manifesto. We felt then we could to launch a campaign to deepen their commitment to reparations. It has to be a mass-based campaign to support the reparations movement.
In Des Moines, Iowa, a small group of people gather to discuss reparations in their city.
Privilege is relative, but at the hood, I own your life.
Right,
you know what
that's
I'm saying?
true.
And so someone is going to ask me, they good?
Right.
Like, you all right? Are they good? And it's my job. If I do not say these exact words, they good, they with me, you guys ain't making it home. Literally. Like, you know what I'm saying? So don't feel bad for being privileged, just share the privilege. So when I go to the bank, you say, he's good, he's with me. Give him that loan. He's good, he's with me.
And wake up to the policies that put that privilege in place. Yeah, and perpetuate it. Yeah.
They're gathering to discuss the restoration of Center Street,
You're talking about gentrification.
a once thriving African American neighborhood now unrecognizable due to gentrification.
I truly want to, ever since I heard about Center Street, I want to see a Center Street. Like, for real. I need to see that in my lifetime. I want to see the Black utopia in Des Moines. And like I said, when I think reparations, I think that's what that reparations would go toward. But is that consistent with the table?
I just got the chills. You talking about you want to see a Center Street again in your life. And like, my dream vision results in a reparations fund initiative that leaders in Black and brown communities in Des Moines decide how that goes. Like, that's what I would like to see is resource redistribution ultimately through a reparations framework. So,
Back in Georgia, we went to the annual Okmulgee cultural celebration.
I hear all kinds of stories. I had people come by and tell me I had a DNA test and I got so much Indian blood, Out of curiosity, I submitted my DNA to Ancestry.com. I come to find out that they couldn't match me up with nothing. 2 times I sent it, and it came back blank again. They can't match me. They said, no match, they can't do nothing. I didn't tell them that I was a Native American because I figured if I am, they should know.
From this celebration of this country's original ancestors,
It's impossible to imagine America without the inheritance of slavery.
to the halls of Washington, D.C., and back to the communities that we come from, the topic of reparations seems to be just below the surface of what so many people are talking about.
Look at that stone right there, that headstone.
Okay.
Again, it's also the ground, right? I mean, who lived on this space, and what were those stories, and what were those truths?
So all the soil washes down.
We have to unearth and speak to today.
Manny,
was getting a car
can you see the light on that stone?
Oh, wow. How are we accountable for justice today? And knowing what's our responsibility and what's our blessing.
Yeah.
What's our inheritance for real from our ancestors. And that they're in us, that they're in our DNA, they're in our dreams. Who knows what the ties that bind us are? And building on that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep, exactly.
Anyway, there's mystery to it.
Totally.
You realize, all right, we got work to do. All right, so that's a piece of this work sample, and now we'd like to talk to you about, as we embarked on making the project, some of the conversations we had about how we made the film, really believing that the way we made the film was as important as the film that we made. Selina, can you hear me? Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Gotcha.
So you can take it from here if you don't mind.
Okay. And for some reason, I can't see my notes now. So what you're looking at are pages in our deck. And we had decided that we really wanted to question our practices before we even started production. And our relationship to each other, our working relationship, and how we wanted to move forward. And we came up with a code of ethics. And this is our code of ethics, and really it was something so we could share with participants in the film, with our crew, with potential partners with the film. And it's a way also to really, for everybody to hold us accountable, for us to hold ourselves accountable, and for others to hold us accountable. And it's still evolving. But these were answers that we came up with after really asking ourselves some tough questions.
So 2 of the first of the 5 commitments we made, or I really like what you said, Selina, that this is emergent, that this practice is emergent, and we're trying things, and we are proceeding with the spirit that they are likely to evolve. But the first rule of ethical engagement, and I'll name 2 that we were doing this in broader community, not just me and Selina, but Sahar Driver is our impact strategist, and She's been such a wonderful leader in this realm and has been of great help to us in the past and on this project. And also one of our associate producers, Elspeth Gelmore, was a conversation partner in this process too. And then of course we broadened out to the broader group of folks who are involved in the film. But the first one is the notion of beneficial engagement, that we would engage our participants at the beginning of our relationship on the film with them and say, what's in it for you? How might this be a blessing for you? Here's to be as transparent as we could about the process, about what we hoped might come from the process and the film and the impact campaign on the other side of the film, and why they might say yes and what they hoped for and wished for. And then talking with each of the participants about how we can be of service to them as they partner with us in sharing their story with the world. So some of the examples of things that were requested or that we offered were offering footage, being participants in fundraising for their work. You saw Mamie Hillman, the African-American historian in the county from which my family comes. We just were partners on a GoFundMe campaign that raised the balance of the budget she needed to open her museum. And that was one example of how, of an outcome of this conversation, frankly. PR support, we also provided consultation and some labor on her website that just launched last week, and it's great. I'll put the links in the chat once I'm off share screen. And then training. We're really interested in an ethic of co-mentorship, that everybody has a lot to learn and that we all have something to offer and teach as well. So in these communities where we are filming, are there folks who would like to participate in the crew and be mentored in regard to filmmaking or some other aspect of the work we do, fundraising, for example. And as I said, inspired by that conversation at the Good Pitch prep work that Sam Feder really led, we decided that we would donate $500 as an honorarium to the participants who agreed to share their stories with the film, particularly the participants who identified as folks who had experienced harm, injury, oppression in regard to the histories that we're committed to repairing and the systems of oppression that have grown for them. The second rule of ethical engagement is that this is so, it's so radical in regard to our practice that we've revised our release, and now our release is a contract that we co-sign and that offers a license for the footage and the opportunity for the people who are being filmed to use the footage into the future for their organizations, their own personal use. So it's a real understanding of shared use. And I remember, Selina, on both of these fronts, the conversations, the sort of wrestles we had with our own understanding of what we should do and what's practical, what's pragmatic, what's affordable, what's prudent. And I'm really glad that we've committed to these two. And is it enough? I don't know, but it's something.
Well, and it's really, I'm just going to jump in for a second. That particular one is, kind of goes against, the rules of documentary and journalism. But it's actually been great and wonderful. And I know probably most productions can't do it, but it's something that we've budgeted for in the beginning. And it's not something we go into relationship with our people in the film, you know, red flagging, but it is, yeah, but it's part of the conversation, and so that it's collaborative, truly collaborative, and not, again, extracting story.
Selina, let me ask you a question. When you say it's been great, what comes to mind? Can you think of a moment?
Well, we just finished a shoot in Georgia, and I have been, you know, after the shoot, contacting everybody and asking whether they would like, you know, our honorarium to go to them or to their organization, or an organization that they want to support. And everyone is so excited. And so it's pretty intimate, actually, to have that exchange. And it just, you know, they're thankful, but it's more than monetary thankful. It's us actually being in relation with them, and them knowing that we really honor them and what they've given in the filmmaking. So we have gone to the next page, hiring practices. So I think I said in the beginning that I think this is probably one of the first things that we have always tried to commit to, not tried to, we have committed to. And it's interesting now to kind of see, you know, the Academy Awards saying you're not going to be nominated unless you know, do X, Y, Z, or the Hollywood writers that some of the celebrities are having the production companies sign.
The inclusion writers, yeah.
Yes, yeah. And it's, to me, a no-brainer to have a diverse crew and staff and advisory team. And it is, you're getting the talents and the gifts and the perspectives that you wouldn't have. I mean, if you were non-inclusive, basically. And on that, we have also committed to, because we film in lots of different cities, so really trying to hire locally as much as we can. We have a core team that is very diverse, but then we try and reach out locally to broaden our team, which has also been fantastic, just on a really logistical level, but also in sharing. And yeah, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but because there's another question about it, but kind of the relationships that we build on the ground when we're actually shooting. And then pay equity is another, I think with independent films, is tricky because a lot of people don't have money. And pay equity doesn't, it's just really important. And it's important to at least have the conversations before you go into production so that everybody knows what their relationship is with pay. And for me as a producer, it's really important to also not overwork people, and really have, you know, good production ethics in terms of the hours that you work, and feeding people, and, you know, treating people as you would like to be treated. To me, is just like the bottom line. If you wouldn't want to be on my production, or if I wouldn't want to be on my production, then nobody else would, right? and those are, to me, are really ABC, and things that were easy to come to in our talking through what our commitments were and what we wanted people to know. Macky, you're muted.
The last of these 5 rules of ethical engagement, which are buckets in a sense, is the commitment to community, to being in relationship with the many partners and circles of partners on the project. So that means the crew, that means the donor partners, that means impact partners early on and throughout the process. It means the participants, and it means the communities in which we are filming. And so a couple of examples in that regard that occur to me. One is that now every time we do because we're filming in different locations, Iowa, Massachusetts, California, Louisiana, Georgia, Washington, we have communities of crew in these different areas, from interns to sound people to assisting cameras and like. And we've done something on this project that I've never done, and that is that we communicate. We're working to nurture us. And it's interesting to do this in the time of COVID, a sense of collective. And so we share with people in Des Moines that we're filming in Georgia, and then we do a report out. And every, I don't know, couple of months, we do like a hangout on Zoom, and we've done different kinds of hangouts with the crew. We've done them purely social. One time, one of us fell ill, and it was a kind of love-in. And we've done report outs on shoots. We did one that was a research share where we said, look, in regard to racial justice and the reparations dimension of racial justice, we're all learning in that regard in our own lives and through whatever you call it, the media or what's being said in the public square. And so let's just gather and share thoughts. And it was through the roof. And I got to say that there was an intern, a college student, who in that share, there were, I don't know, maybe 12 people on the call or 10 people on the call, who shared about a book that she had read in a class that was completely the like transformational moment in the conversation. And then it felt like through the doorway of her sharing, we all got real. And I think it was powerful for the group to feel in it together like that, and for there to be a relative, I mean, I want to be very careful in regard to power, but a way in which people's voices were being honored, whether they were a college intern or a co-director. Similarly, when we did this work sample, we sent it out to everybody who's in the work sample. Oh my God. So the way in which that, I mean, I just thought, oh, what are you doing? This is so, you're so vulnerable, which ultimately is a good sign, though I don't want vulnerable people to be more vulnerable or vulnerable in risky ways than they ought to be. But in this regard, just as Selina, you said about it being a blessing and more profound than just the transfer of resources, which is also important. The transfer of power in this regard and the sharing of image at this early moment. We're not going to be done until 2022, but that we were putting something out in the world about them and not doing it without their, and considering not doing it without their consent and blessing was a red flag, and people were really affirming and glad. So those are some thoughts in regard to community, but we're thinking iteratively and as we go. about what we mean by community within our communities. Let me see, I think there should be one. Yeah.
We've got a few questions from the audience just about compensating your subjects. We have some interest in that. They would like to know more about how that works, and apparently, you know, PBS doesn't allow filmmakers to compensate their subjects, and it sounds like it's contrary to the, like you said, the traditional journalistic approach. How does that work for you? And do you think it? I think the concern with journalism is there's a potential for their contribution to be skewed in some way, or the information that they provide isn't as genuine. Do you think that's valid? Have you seen that or not seen that? I'd love to hear more about your experience with compensating your subjects.
Well, we're not journalists, number one. And I think that is actually a big difference. And no, it goes back to us being, you know, we're making this film in collaboration. I need to pay myself to make this film, and I also need to pay everybody who's involved. And really, it's an honorarium. It's not, you know, you work for, you know, a few hours and we're paying you. It's an honorarium. It's in good faith, and it is to support them or their organization in any way that they want to have it. So but yeah, in terms of, we don't know yet if we're going to get our hands slapped in terms of the industry. But in terms of storytelling, it's all good.
I love these, this code of ethics that you guys have put together. And I think that a lot of these are also questions that I asked, and sort of some of the similar, process-wise, some of the similar conclusions that I came to in my own process. And I'll say, as far as paying folks in the documentaries, you know, I think that I was told, you know, I sought advice from a lot of more seasoned filmmakers, and I was told this idea that, like, oh, I had this feeling that, like, oh, like, if you're a real filmmaker, like, right, that you're not supposed to do, there's like this whole list of like hidden rules that I kind of kept bumping up against in what felt natural to me as like a community organizer to do. And so one of them, this was definitely at the top of the list, because, you know, one of the folks I was filming with was an undocumented person. She was a Zumba teacher, and she taught Zumba classes like 7 days a week. And she had the worst schedule, right? Because it was like 1 hour in the morning and then 6 hours off and then 2 hours, and you know, and so she was making like, and so we kept trying to schedule times to film with her, but then it wouldn't, you know, it really wasn't very economical on our end to pay people in these like fragments of days. And when I said, oh, well, how much do you make with these classes? Like, could I pay you the amount that you would be making, you know, in order to film on that day? She's like, well, you know, I make $60 a day. And I was like, you know, I think to me, it was just glaring. I'm like, oh my God, like, how can I pay this cinematographer? You know, he's cutting me a great rate, but I'm paying him like $400 a day. How am I going to pay this woman $60 a day? Like, you know, and then the idea that then that would even be prohibited, you know, to me was like, well, this, like, how are we talking about racial or economic justice if we're not going to be compensating folks who are, you know, just on the edge of poverty? And a similar situation arose with someone we were filming with, and just before our trip, you know, she was getting ready to get evicted because she owed 3 months back rent, which was a total of like $700, you know? And so I think that when I think about the scale of these production budgets, and then I think about the amount of money that would make a huge and concrete difference in the lives of the people that I'm working with, it feels like it's morally, there is no question to me that, like, obviously if a cinematographer's day is worth a certain amount, then like, why isn't this person's day worth a certain amount? And that it would be exploitive, it feels like, to not sort of take that position. And so, but you know, I think that to me, I guess how we went about it was that we, I structured, and part of the goal from the beginning was that I wanted to be able to do outreach with communities and really have conversations. And the point of the film was to get into deep, meaningful conversations in community with people. And so I created a speakers bureau, and then the people in the film were people that were in the speakers bureau, and a lot of them were these activists that had, you know, like decades of experience. And you know, to me, it's always best when you can raise money by doing the thing that you want to be doing, as opposed to you know, appealing to people for some second or third hand goal, right? So I was like, well, our goals are to be talking, like centering trans people of color's voices and talking about their own experience. My goal is to create conversations and build community among isolated trans folks, and is to really shift a national conversation around transgender issues in a way that centers issues that are most important to trans people of color. And so what we found was that doing these speakers bureau engagements, you know, I kind of created a whole system and structure, and these folks had been speaking, but mostly for free or for $100 here and there. And we created this structure and like a nice packaging for that, and created this little, like there were several workshops that went with each sort of short film, and we're able to just help them get access to and broker these deals to get these speaking engagements, where they're then getting paid thousands of dollars for spending a couple hours of their time. And so that's kind of how we sort of ended up, because I was like, well, I'm not going to pay you out of the production budget because I hear that maybe that's going to, you know, discredit me or something. But I don't think that it should discredit you, one, but two, we were able to kind of get around that. And also in other ways by, I guess, like for instance, you know, housing was one thing. You know, a lot of these folks live in the South, they have a lot of space, they have extra bedrooms. And so, you know, when possible, you know, I stayed with them, and then I paid them the amount that I would pay via an Airbnb. Because like, well, why pay someone else $150 if this, you know, is gonna support you? And so thinking a lot like that, like how do we go to the restaurants that are owned by your family? How do we, you know, or we can pay you if you're gonna be our host and cook for us, right? Is there ways that we can build in these things that we would normally be paying for otherwise, but in order to help support the people that are immediately involved in the process. And in the process, you build a better community, you have a better relationship. And I don't think that it undermines your ability to make the film at all. If anything, it makes people trust you and feel like you value what they're bringing to the table.
That's great.
Yes.
Oh, Macky.
I love everything you just said. And what is inspiring to me about it is how creative and how transformative it is. But it's also basic, good-hearted common sense.
Kindness.
So what does it mean to be a good person and do this work? And how have we been taught in this industry to be wired differently and to call that good practice? So André, you're naming the fact that our tradition has been an arm of settler colonialism and is one of the ethnographic practices that white folk have used throughout the history of empire building. That's not the only history. There's also media activism and all, but that one is so up in our set of practices that the questions that are being asked were the questions that were making our hearts beat. Like, is this gonna screw it all up? Will we no longer be legit? And so I both really am grateful for people asking the questions. We need to ask the questions. We need to really air these lies. and then begin to really practice saying with one another why they're a code for a system and structure that has evil up in it. And because, I mean, we know as documentary filmmakers, all the shit we're doing with our subjects, our participants, like the whole work is about like, how can, you know, at least the way I was like, how can you get them to give you the good stuff? How do you trick them into being vulnerable and catching it on film? And then you air it with the whole wide world and have all rights. There was a moment when I was filming out in Des Moines, and we were in relationship with this community that you saw in the film of people who are working to reverse urban renewal and to think about, all right, what does it mean not just to be playing defense, but to invest optimally in the flourishing of Black lives in Des Moines. And they invited us into the process early, and we had all really thought a lot about relationship with this group of 10 folks. But then there was one meeting they asked us just to show up for on a dime. And so I flew in with our little camera and was flying out the next morning, and I showed up, and 2 new activists joined the circle in the middle of the meeting. And I was tired. I had flown out that day. I was recording sound and picture, and I was going to sleep on one of the people's floors that night, just like you say, André. And at the end, I slapped down a film release in front. Like, I didn't slap down. Like I said, "Hi, nice to meet you. My name's Macky. Here's our film release. I don't think you were with us last time we were filming." And then I was just rapping, and I could barely think. It had been hours. One of them came up to me and said, "So can we talk about this document?" And I said, "Sure." And I knew exactly what was going to go down in this room of activists. She's like, "Okay, so this print is really small. There's a lot in here, and it's on one page. The print's really small. It's like, you don't want me to read it, but I can read it. So now that I've read it, it's in this language of legalese that's like so hard to wade through that it's as if you don't want me to understand it, but I can understand it. And so I just want to say, as we embark on this collaboration around reparations, the fact that you're asking to own my body and voice in perpetuity in a way that could make you can sell it to anybody, anytime for the rest of history. Doesn't that remind you of something?" Wow. And I said, "You know what? You're absolutely right. Like this is how I was taught. Like this release, but I've known this moment is coming, and you don't have to ever, I'm not doing a song and dance. You don't have to ever sign this. You don't have to. But I just want to name that I think this was the moment that Selina and I have been waiting for, and that we're going to pivot on." And so that's just one of those times where we just need to keep listening to one another as we ask the questions. And when I said that, she was like, "Oh my gosh, you're actually going to respond in that way? That's amazing. I love you." And then
I love that she called you out on it and right. Felt comfortable enough in that moment to do that. Or she was just a kick-ass person and was bold enough to, to really zero in on something that bothered her. So appreciate that.
Yeah, and since then, that's why we have redone it. And that's why it's a agreement rather than a release.
I love that. Well, we're actually running short on time, but I did want to get to one question, just, about this big question that's being debated right now, about who should be telling these minority stories. And I know, André, you touched on that briefly earlier, but, there's a lot of separation that's happening between these groups. You shouldn't make that story because you're not of that community, you should make the story because you are, instead of sort of blanketing that separation, what kinds of questions really should filmmakers ask themselves when they're considering a topic as a film idea, if they're drawn to something that they want to make, but maybe they're not of that community, but it's still something that interests them, and they feel compelled, or they're drawn to it in some way. So what kinds of things can they do if they're looking at something like that?
I can say 2 words, but Macky, both you and André, it is super interesting and can be a hard question. I believe, one of the movements now is to let people tell their own stories. To me, that is it's more important to actually, it's basically, if you're a white male wanting to tell the story of a community outside of your world, the problem is you are privileged enough probably to do that. And it's really, how are we redistributing the resources so that the people of the communities can also tell their stories. I'm not going to say people cannot tell other stories, but I know Macky has said many times, if you're wondering whether you're the right person to be telling the story, maybe you're not, right? And again, this is like really, it's being transparent, and it's also really, as filmmakers, we need to be taking inventory. And why is it that you want to be telling this story, and what is it about your voice that is needed, that is necessary? Interest is great, but it has to go beyond that, to me.
Mm-hmm. André, do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a question to ask is, how can I support others? I think that's something I've been thinking a lot about, is, just like it frustrates me, the idea that, like, oh, if you're the director, you're like, this idea that we're supposed to be in these kind of siloed positions, and that particularly if you're a successful director, then what that would mean is that you then are always the director, and that you're never going to be sort of the producer of someone else's project, for instance, even though you have the networks and connections and your experience that might actually be really beneficial to someone, particularly maybe who's less experienced, but is from a community that hasn't had a chance to share their own voices and stories before, or very much. And so I guess I'm just like, is there a way that you can actually support someone else who is from that community, who has ideas and excitement around that story? And I think that part of what it means to decenter whiteness, right, and decenter maleness means that maybe we'll have fewer opportunities. And that's fine. I think that that's something that we need to, part of this idea of reparations, right, is this idea of like, well, maybe I don't actually deserve all of the opportunities that I've been given, and not that I haven't worked hard, but actually maybe someone else also is deserving of those things. And so sometimes it means taking a step back. And I think that, like if I was to do this project over, I guess maybe I just didn't really understand how much like this auteur filmmaker thing, and how much being the director, I guess because I come from a community organizing kind of background, I was like, oh, I'm just kind of the facilitator of this story, I'm bringing the people with the cameras together and the community together, and I'm facilitating other people's visions and understandings of what their story is. I'm trying to help it come into reality. But I guess I thought of myself as almost like a doula or something. Right. But in actuality, what happened was, yeah, I was on the, bill that we sent out that had all the workshops, you know, and I had like 3 and everybody else had 3, but I got requested way more than everyone else in the project. And I'm like, in retrospect, I guess I do feel conflicted about that, to say, well, I am the most white passing person on the team, and I am the most, you know, that in other ways I'm like more privileged than a lot of other folks on the team. And so it's like, well, how, like, I guess, yeah, how can we shift those dynamics as a whole, but then also just thinking about, like, maybe I would have a co-director, or maybe I would work with a collective, or maybe I would have each episode kind of have a co-director that is from that community, or, you know, so just thinking more about how do you support other people is my answer. If your sort of go-to urge is like, oh, I should be at the center and I should be the director, maybe that's not necessarily true, and that doesn't mean that you can't have like a long career, that you're being unsuccessful just because you're supporting someone else's moment to be in the spotlight and have a strong voice and have more editorial control.
I like that. That kind of goes to my next question, probably my final question, which is about the idea of democratizing the filmmaking process. And I've picked up some things about what that means, and it's really just a way to, like you said, sort of eliminate the hierarchy that exists on film sets, and I'm wondering, and like basically giving everyone the opportunity to weigh in on the film, or what's unfolding in front of you. You know, if there's a scene that's being, if there's footage that's being shot, does the DP have a chance to talk about whether or not it's a good idea to do this, if they're not liking how it's going, if they're uncomfortable with it, or, you know, if there's a system in place to allow your crew or other people supporting you to give you feedback. And I'm wondering if any of you have experienced that, if it's helpful, if it complicates the process, if it, you know, if it improves the story. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. Macky, I think you had a reaction to that.
It was really just happiness that you were asking the question.
Right.
So we do. Our team is like our family. And so just like a year ago, we were all back in Georgia shooting, and it was before COVID, and we all we rented a big house so we could all be together, which was wonderful. And if you can do it, I would suggest it, you know, whether it's like sleeping on someone's floor or crashing, you know, somebody. And so the end of every day was our check-in time. So we would make dinner together, and everybody would go around and share, you know, what was meaningful today, what worked, what didn't work. And it was huge. It's was powerful for all of us to be able to share, to be able to hear, you know, what other people's questions are, and then in just even with me and Macky, which I don't know if people, I think we kind of, you know, I've always been a producer, and Macky has always been a director, and I produced his first directorial, you know, his first film. And for this project, part of in this work we're doing was to share the roles, and that right there shifts dynamics of power, and has been, and then it trickles down, right? And yeah, so we are, and what Macky already said, it's like, and it's not just when we're in each other's face because now we're not, but even prior to COVID, we still would have sharing time with our team, which is, you know, on lots of different levels. And yeah, everybody chimes in, and their participation in what we're making in community is super valuable, super valuable. And, you know, I was trained as a tour, as, you know, way back in the 80s, film school. And as I think a lot of people were, but working in collaboration is way better. It just is. It's like, yeah. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, Macky.
I want to say something that I know to be true, but I don't have the data to back it. And that is that in love and in art and in liberation, it is not a zero-sum game. It is not about my loss is your gain. I definitely believe that people who have been over-resourced, like myself, our assignment is to redistribute that power and money and space. But it's like what Selina said about sharing resource with the participants in the film. It's like amazing. Things are opening up in that transaction or in that shift or in that agreement. And I really feel that creatively. So I want to say, even when you were talking about what movies people ought to make, look, there may only be so many slots at Sundance. There may be only so many slots at Netflix. There may be so many, and those should now go to people who have been underrepresented. It is time to hear stories from the people we haven't heard from, and also the people who have the best perspective on liberation for all on this planet. That's what time it is, right? It's been that time, it's that time now. That said, that doesn't mean that we artists, and we're all artists, ought not to be creative like crazy with a mind toward liberation. And I think when we do it collectively, collaboratively, in different ways, it brings us joy, and it brings other people's joy. I don't know exactly what the equation is, but I want to say that, as André said earlier, this is good news for everybody in the end. And it might not feel like it. It might feel like loss, and certainly there's sacrifice. But if you've been living a lie all this time, if you've been oppressing, or just been benefiting from other people oppressing, which means complicit, I guarantee you, in your unconscious, in your soul, you are troubled, and you would rather be well.
Thank you for that. Yes, André.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, I think to me, it's all about collaboration, and it's about collaboration at every stage. It's about collaboration with so many different kinds of stakeholders, right? So it's like, and I think that I'm in every meeting, in every space, you know, how I try to show up in those spaces is to be trying to deconstruct this power dynamic that is already implicit in all of these interactions all the time, you know? So I feel like I always am like, and also with people in the film, you know, I'm always like, hey, like, this is how it normally goes down. I know that's problematic in X, Y, and Z ways, and I'm trying to not do that. And so, you know, and I think people really respect you when you level with them, right? And so I'm just like, as much as possible, my intentions I'm gonna bring into this space are to honor your voice and to listen to you. I'm really excited about being in this process. And I'm excited that I get to learn things, you know, as I go, and I'm probably gonna make mistakes. And so if there are times when something that I say or do is, you know, really getting at you, or you don't feel respected, it is so important to me that you know, that we can have space to really talk about that. And I'm willing to be accountable. You know, and so I really just try to be very, I guess, transparent about like, you know, these are my intentions. This is what I want. I know that sometimes the way that I might act or how things might come up that kind of undermine that. And like what I'm hoping for is that we can have a relationship and that we can be in a relationship with each other where we can grow, and that I know there's a lot that I have to learn. So really trying to build that as a foundation. And that's a conversation I have like with the subjects, which I call participants, I don't know, but also a conversation I have with the community advisory board. And that's and that's just the conversations. And I try to put people in conversation with each other as much as possible, so that it's not, so that they can, so that they can also have a certain kind of like energy or dynamic or be in relationship with each other. And so, yeah, I definitely think it's a great idea to, if you can all stay in a house or, and then as far as like visioning, and you were mentioning the idea that, there's this idea almost that you're supposed to like trick people into giving you something. I gave away the script, I was like, hey, this is how I'm seeing and understanding your life. Here are some of the things that stick out to me as interesting, and this is why. What do you think about that? And because then you can also kind of co-create with them. Because I was like, what kind of footage if there's any events in your life that are coming up that you think might kind of deal with or navigate these kinds of questions, your relationship to militarism, how you've been let down by the state, like how you've been let down by churches, you're navigating your sexuality in relationship to your religion. If any kind of topics like that come up, let me know. And then it was great because there were times when they called me, often at the last minute, but then they called me and were like, oh, I am having this, I am getting ready to go do a training at Fort Bragg about trans people in the military. And I didn't think about it, but maybe that's something you'd be interested in coming to. And I'm like, what? This is perfect. I'm getting on a plane. When is it? And I'm like, well, tomorrow. And I'm like, all right, it's fine. We'll figure it out, But so you can kind of be in a more collaborative and enriching experience. And to me, my goal out of the process was that people, by engaging in it, also learn something about themselves and are able to have a space to reflect about their own experiences in a way that's meaningful to them. And so, and I think that will ultimately create the better film, because when people are engaging in deep reflective work, it helps, it helps viewers kind of see and understand their lives differently. And so to me, that's why I think that that's what the process documentary and the heart of it is about. It's like, how do I facilitate that process? And how do I capture something meaningful that can transmit to others about what is happening?
Yes, I appreciate you also saying that, we're all going to make mistakes. That's part of the process. And I think having these conversations and building blocks is really important, because this is it's a historical time right now, and an opportunity for us to learn and to grow, and that's really what I was hoping today would help some of our filmmakers do, is just getting some ideas for how to keep moving forward. A lot of these concepts can be really nebulous and really sort of broad and feel like you can't actually do anything about it as a single individual human on this earth. But it sounds like all three of you have really done some, small things that have actually had a really big impact when you're making your films. And so I hope our viewers have gotten some ideas. I have been seeing a lot of things related to the contract that you, Macky and Selina, have written up, and someone even wants to see it to use it as a template. So I don't know if that's something you'd be interested in doing, but we can talk about that offline. But I love that. I love that, some tangible things that people can do. So yes, yeah.
Deborah Kaufman just posted and said, thanks, and so glad to be here. It just makes me actually remember how many wise people are likely with us now. And so how we do a kind of practice share through you, Isabella, and thank you so much for creating this space.
Yeah.
We need that. we need that. We're simply some filmmakers, or Selina and I are two filmmakers who you asked me to tell us what we're doing. And I really believe, and it's been so enriched what we're doing by listening to what other people are doing. So everybody out there, thanks for listening. And if you have thoughts of what might work better, we've put our Facebook page up here, our Instagram page.
Put the drive up. I'll put email if people want to email directly.
And if, as André said, if there are ways that given that we have been around for a while and do have access, can be of service, like sharing contracts. I love that idea. We're in, right, Selina?
Yes. And I actually know the filmmaker who asked.
Oh, so great.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Yeah, you know, I know COVID has impacted our lives terribly this year, but one small thing that's good is we've been able to coalesce from all over the place into this space online and share our thoughts and ideas maybe a little bit easier than having to be in a physical space together. So this is sort of allowing us to have these conversations. And I love your idea. I mean, maybe having, and so that was all to say we could do more of this. And I feel like having an opportunity to share these kinds of ideas, and it doesn't have to be an hour and a half, it can be 30 minutes. And I think that there is an opportunity here because this is an ongoing conversation. There are things that are becoming new practices every day, and the more we embed them into our industry, the likely they are to really work and to take off. So that's a great idea. So to be continued, maybe.
Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you so much for having me on this panel. I know that I guess I'm much less experienced, but I think that it's so important that we're in conversation together. And I would say a shameless plug. I guess I actually just started. I'm going to be starting a job with the Allied Media Projects. And so if you've never heard of them, the Allied Media Conference has been one of the most inspiring spaces for my career. I've went to for the last 13 years. And it's really a space about intersectionality and the intersection of community organizing and media making. And it's really all about a lot of DIY projects that are using media in unconventional ways and emerging technologies to really support storytelling from impacted communities. And so I definitely would, these kinds of conversations, I think they've been having them for a long time, and they have tons of resources on their websites. If you go to alliedmediaprojects.org, and you can kind of see, just kind of the evolution of different folks. And they actually just started this year, for the first time, they had a documentary specific caucus that was all about documentarians of color, creating storytelling strategies for liberation. And so that's definitely a place where you can get different kinds of resources as well and thought on that.
That's wonderful. What are you going to be doing for them, André, in this new role?
I'm going to be the new director of communications.
Fabulous. Congratulations.
Yeah, really excited.
Yeah, right? All right.
I didn't say thank you. I want to say thank you too. This is really great. Yeah.
I'm so glad. I really enjoyed this as well. And it's been wonderful to meet some filmmakers finally, because I started this role in January, and in March COVID hit. And so I feel like I haven't had that much of a chance to meet all the filmmakers that interest me so much. So this is a great excuse for that. So thank you for participating. Really, it's been great.
It's awesome.
Yeah. All right, everyone.
And local. I'm also. Yeah.
I know. I love that. Yeah. It's fantastic. And you are too, André, right?
I was gonna say, I also live in Berkeley.
Woo! Fabulous. Great. We still love you, Macky. It's fine. Whatever, New York. It's good. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much again. And you will hear from me about our next workshop or something else. I like the idea of an info session. That's kind of an intriguing idea. So because usually we have a big event at the end of the year to celebrate our filmmakers. Obviously we can't really do that. So I am kind of open to other events, other things we can do. Preferably we're going to get past the election next week. We have one more week or less than that. So then hopefully planning can commence. So good luck everyone on that score. And thank you all for joining us. The recording, it has been recorded. I will put the recording up for people and please share as you can, as you see fit. So, all right. Thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. This has been great.
Of course. Take care.
Thanks.
Sure. Bye-bye.